On today's episode of the Going Commando podcast, it is the 2024 free agency recap. There are a lot of new players in Burgundy and Gold that were brought in by Adam Peters and company this offseason, and we're going to break down each position group, guys that were brought in, some guys that were left, and guys re signed. So stick around, stay tuned, and let's get the show started. Welcome to Going Commando, a Washington Commanders podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Going Commando podcast. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Tom and Chris. It's been a couple of months since you last heard from us, and we've got a decent amount to go over. But first off, let's just kind of talk to you guys about how everything is going. It's been a couple of months since we've been in season. Had a little bit more time to reflect on last season, reflect on some of the, coaching staff changes and whatnot. So just, yeah, how's everybody doing?
Doing pretty good, Clark. I think we ended this season on a little bit of a sour note, and I think a lot of us were curious as to where ownership and the head coaches were looking towards. This off season, and I think that we've made a lot of big splashes that have improved my mood and opinion on this team. I'm sure Chris would probably agree with me.
Yeah, good to be back in the lab with you two fellas for sure. Great to be talking about this. There's a lot of good things to be talking about. Really, I've been very pleased and uh, have a lot of confidence has been instilled in me just in how I feel like Adam Peters, Dan Quinn, and the rest of this group, right, have been kind of going about this off season. I just think it's clear they have a different philosophy than what Rivera and company had here previously. And I'm excited to see how it pans out. And I think they've been making a lot of interesting moves, some of which make more sense than others, some of which might make more sense after we get a little bit further here in the off season. But overall, a lot to be excited about for sure.
So let's start there. You mentioned kind of some changing of the way, you like the way that things are being done right now. You like the way that this free agency has gone. We're going to go over all these signings, but kind of to start things off, the approach that this front office has taken, not necessarily taking any big swings at the biggest name free agents, something that we may have done in years past, but instead opting to kind of build out this roster the way that the coaching staff, Dan Quinn and his guys, and Adam Peters kind of see fit. And with that, they signed a lot of quality players, and in doing so, kept a solid amount of cap flexibility, even after bringing in, you know, I think it might have been the most free agent signings of any team. So, wanna just touch on that about how this approach has looked for the Commanders this offseason.
Yeah, and this is a new look Commanders ownership, a new look Commanders head office. I mean, this is really a new organization top to bottom, and you see it with the way that they've attacked free agency so far. Clark, you do make a great point there about us having the most free agents brought in of any team. Now, I would argue that of any team that needed it, especially in an NFC East that continues to get harder and harder by the day, bringing in a bunch of quality veteran guys who can really make a difference and who have been through systems similar to ours, or at least seem to be able to work into the systems which we try to implement with this new coaching staff. It's really been a bit of a welcome reprieve from the past. And I'm sure that we'll get to a few of these where we might see a bit of a head scratch from some of us. We might even be a little bit confused with a few of them, but that's not to say that all of these guys coming in and all of these different and somewhat proven players coming in to get a new look on this team. It's exciting as a fan base and certainly as a podcast. It gives us stuff to talk about. So I'm very happy with the way that this offseason has gone. And there's certainly one rather large thing left to go, but I think that we put the pieces together to the point where we will be very comfortable no matter who we take in this upcoming draft.
Agreed. And to both of y'all's point, it was cool to see us having so much activity on the free agency front, and not necessarily just the big, big swing and often miss signings that we would do in years past under the Snyder leadership. So it was cool to see that, and I think, look, it's a different strategy. Ron's strategy of all young guys and an all young centered team around youth, it didn't work. Clearly, you need a balance of both young guys and established veteran players. Ron's strategy led to really just a lack of identity, you know, apathetic leadership to an extent, and just didn't work out as intended. I think Peters knows you need balance, and that's why he's bringing in some of these guys who maybe have been around the league for a few years, still have some gas left in the tank, but maybe aren't necessarily these exciting young prospects that other teams or other coaches will seem to kind of have tunnel vision focus on, right? So I just think a team with all young guys has no identity rather, and it can't lead in a sustainable way. So I think that's been interesting to see, and then I also think Peters has done a really good job of addressing needs prior to the draft, and what I mean by that is he's alleviated the pressure to fix everything at once. Right? There's no need to panic now going into this draft because he's made certain free agency signings that it doesn't feel like we need to fix everything and or that everywhere is a hole right on this team. I think there's a lot of holes left and a lot of areas that could use bolstering. Um, but he's been smart in the way he's been going about it. So now, when the draft comes along, they can focus on okay, the couple, one, two, three positions where they know they need to take a guy early, and can stay focused on that, and then can also focus on maybe best player available as we get later in the draft, right? Because they're not so hyper focused on, oh my gosh, we need not only do we need a QB and a tackle, oh we need a wide receiver, we need a tight end, we need another edge rusher, we need cornerbacks, right? Those are all areas of the team that we need, but he's done a good job of addressing those so far. So overall, I've just been really pleased with that philosophy, not having to cram everything that we need to do in this offseason just into a draft, coupled with one or two big free agency signings. It's quite the opposite approach, which I think hopefully will serve us well as this offseason continues and the year progresses.
Absolutely. And with that being said, you know, most of these contracts didn't necessarily break the bank either. You addressed a lot of needs. You brought in a lot of guys that are going to be starters on this team. You aren't necessarily paying, breaking out the Brinks truck for, an all pro kind of guy. Um, but without that being said, there's definitely some big names still that were brought in. So I want to start breaking this down with you guys, kind of going through all of our free agent signings first, those that played elsewhere previously that we brought in, and then we can kind of touch on some of the other guys that were ultimately brought back from the team previously. Um, but I think the obvious place to start is on the offensive side of the ball, and with the biggest name being brought in, running back Austin Eckler from the Los Angeles Chargers, a mainstay in fantasy football for years and years now, and he gets his opportunity to come to Washington, kind of leave that new regime they have there with the Chargers, and he gets to come here on a pretty relative team friendly contract. He's only making I believe, upwards of 12 million over the course of 2 years. So he's not necessarily breaking the bank, and he may be on the older side for running back, but one of the best kind of scat backs in the league.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Eckler first, Clark. I think that again that's a really really good example of Peters and company, going out and finding an established player in a position group that they need and not breaking the bank to do so. I think we saw that across the board. Guys on cheaper deals or 1-2 year deals. Some of these guys, will make the roster. Some of them won't. Some of them are guys that are really there to be camp bodies or kind of provide adequate competition for some other guys that they probably have in mind as actually making the final 53. So I think that's a part of the philosophy too. And again, you see it here with Eckler. I'm excited for Eckler. I think that was something we've lacked since the departure of J.D. McKissic, really, from this team is a true pass catching kind of scat third down back. And the good thing about Eckler is I think he can do a lot more than just a J.D. McKissic. He also can take handoffs and be effective, as a more of a traditional back as well. So I'm excited for him. I'm excited to have a mentor and a veteran in that room to continue to mentor guys like a Brian Robinson Jr., like a Chris Rodriguez, if he ends up ultimately making this team again. As well as perhaps we won't get into too much speculation. I think there's room for another potential draftee or UDFA to come into the room. I know they did also sign Jeremy McNichols, who had previously had some experience with Peters in San Francisco and is kind of a journeyman back. But overall, really pleased with that signing. I think it adds, really a veteran presence to that backfield that was lacking uh, over the course of pretty much Rivera's entire tenure. I mean, he came in and immediately got rid of Adrian Peterson, as we all remember, and I was staunchly against that at the time, and we all see how these years under Rivera panned out. I think it's good to have a veteran amongst that backfield and just more veterans on this offensive unit as a whole.
Absolutely, and I think I might be in a bit of shock by this one because while I do believe Austin Eckler is a great running back, and I think that he's going to be a valuable addition to this team, to me, it just didn't necessarily make sense for us to go out into the running back market. I mean, we have Brian Robinson Jr., who we have all, and I mean all of us who are Commanders fans, have kind of rallied around him as being a guy who really might be the future of this backfield, looking forward in the next 2 to 3 years. And you kind of hamstring him a bit by having Austin Eckler come in and take away snaps. And mind you, this is a team which we saw 50 plus pass attempts last year under Bieniemy. We have another very throwing focused offensive coordinator in Cliff Kingsbury. So it kind of is interesting to me that you see guys like Austin Eckler get brought in. And Clark, you do make a good point. It is on a very team friendly contract. We are not paying him very much at all, especially for the amount of sort of value he brings to this team. You're going to see him be used almost in tandem, if not probably more than Brian Robinson Jr. And it's even more interesting when you consider the fact that we saw guys like Chris Rodriguez Jr. take a number of snaps as the running back in the backfield. So it was seemed a little bit abnormal to me that we would be going out into the running back market and spending money on one of these guys. But for the reasons you state, Clark, about the contract reasons, and also the fact that, yes, he is a great scat back. He's not just a running back. He can catch the ball. He can change the dynamic of the offense in a lot of interesting ways. Um, he is a good addition. And Chris, it is interesting you touch on Jeremy McNichols there because I think that is another guy who does deserve to be mentioned in this whole thing. I know that we probably were considering about getting to him later, but I think it's interesting how he affects this running back room because I think that you'll see that guy as a person who's probably going to be just a camp body, and I think that ultimately he's a name that we will probably end up cutting before the season starts.
Yeah, with McNichols, I'm getting Jonathan Williams vibes from him. Um, just as kind of that they kind of know what they're getting in him. He's a kind of an older, getting to be an older back in this league, right? So agreed. I don't think that if anything, he's there to kind of pressure test and get a pulse check on Rodriguez, right? I mean, Rodriguez wasn't although I do like C Rod, he was not a guy that was picked by this current regime, staff, and ownership, right? So I don't think he's necessarily a lock for this roster, and I think they maybe wanted to see kind of turn up the heat on him a little bit too, potentially. Do I think he has the edge over McNichols? Yeah, but a lot to be seen there. I will say though, I actually am not as surprised as you are, Tom, that they went out and got a guy like Austin Eckler, especially with the departure of Antonio Gibson. You really did need, another established back in this room and in this group, because without him, it's really just Brian Robinson Jr., who's still very early on and young in his career, right? So I I understand some of the head scratching there, but I also think it was a necessary thing that needed to be done. I think you needed to reestablish some experience within the room that'll ultimately help the younger guys as well. So I'm excited for it, but that, needless to say, that doesn't mean that I'm hoping for a decrease in B Rob carries. I actually think you will see an increase in Brian Robinson carries there's because in my opinion, Austin Eckler is more of a true receiving and a scat back than Gibson was, frankly. So I think you'll see still the majority of those between the tackles, first and second down touches being to a guy like B Rob. I think the next guy you even hand off in that situation might not even be an Eckler. Potentially, we'll have to see. But again, I really like the move.
And Eckler, I will say, I've watched a lot of Chargers games on prime time. They always seem to sneak them in on us, even if they are, super mid that year. They just kind of always seems to throw the powder blues on prime time. But nonetheless, I mean, this guy, he's a scat back. He's great at catching out of the backfield, but I mean, he's also their goal line back. I mean, they would give the guy the ball at the 2 and 1 yard line because his workout videos. I don't know if you ever seen them. They're insane. I mean, he's an incredible athlete, and um, we're not going to be using him maybe as to the extent that the Chargers were that since we have a Brian Robinson, but I think he'll be a great compliment. And kind of going off that, I was also thinking during that conversation, Gibson, of course, losing him is kind of part of that deal. He ended up signing a 3-year deal for 11 million with the New England Patriots. So of roughly a similar, one additional year and a similar price tag, but ultimately, I think that's worth it. But we keep looking down the offense here. The next position group I'm going to move to is the offensive linemen that we end up going out and signing. Those being Nick Allegretti, a guard from the Kansas City Chiefs, Michael Dieter, a center from the Houston Texans, and then another center, Tyler Biadasz, starting center last season for the Dallas Cowboys. So bringing a couple of new bodies to this offensive line, not to mention the re-signing of Cornelius Lucas as well. So bringing in some veteran guys to try to address the offensive line. I don't know that I necessarily see all of these guys being, be all end all. I see Nick Allegretti as a guy potential to start. Biadasz should be our starting center, I would imagine. Corin Lucas, I would imagine, would find a spot on there, but to go along with really the only returner kind of in Sam Cosmi. So what do you guys think about this offensive line and the signings we've made? Does it stop there? Is this going to be a position group that you expect to see us target in the draft?
So yeah, this is a really interesting group, and I'm gonna say this right now. I'm not as high on Nick Allegretti as some of the people who may be listening to this podcast are. He's a Kansas City retread. We of course have experience with that from this past year with Andrew Wiley, who couldn't seem to stop getting holding penalties or false starts and really sort of hurt our team at times. So I'm not too high on him. Tyler Bihash that we got from the Cowboys is a great center. However, I think we might see him move to the right guard position over Allegretti, depending on how these things sort of play out with the new coaching staff and where they see the value of Nick Allegretti really being best suited. I will say I'm a big fan of Michael Dieter. He was a consistent force for a Houston team that sort of shocked the entire football world with how well they were, considering they were drafting the number 2 overall pick last year, and then they of course traded up for the number 3 pick as well. But center is really an interesting position on the offensive line, and it's a position that is sort of seen as the quarterback of the offensive line because a lot of these guys are working with the quarterback to read the defense, really sort of doing the on the fly assignments for each of those guys along the line. And those guys are really integral to the success of an offensive line up front, but also to the success of the quarterback of a team. So to bring in two guys who both seem to have a lot of experience in what are admittedly positive situations before coming to the Commanders, um, it's really refreshing to see. And I think that you're going to see these guys have a big impact, whether that is negative or positive, on the success of this team and the success of this offense moving forward. I would like to say, though, I'm not opposed to seeing Dieter start over Bihash. I think Michael Dieter is a guy who really sort of proved his value last year, and he got a contract with another team, uh, which is not a small thing in this league. I mean, it's a league where if you don't produce, you're moved out very quickly, and both of these guys prove that they deserve these contracts. And I think that you'll see a little bit of movement with this offensive line. It's also important to note that we do have a re-signed person on this as well in Corin Lucas, coming back to the position group, to the offensive line as a whole in the right tackle position group, individually. So I think this offensive line is sadly going to be a little bit patchwork to begin with. Maybe they try and see where guys best fit. Maybe that happens in preseason so we can avoid that in the regular season. But I would not be surprised if you see a lot of movement of these guys into different spots and positions until we find an ideal group to put out there as our front five.
Yeah, I actually think this is one of the hardest groups to predict what that starting five is going to look like come week one. One, because I think there's going to be more players, and I mean players with multiple, in the plural, right, added to this, roster. Staying away from too much draft talk. I think that we will take not one but two tackles if I'm making a prediction in the draft. One earlier and one later. But overall, I agree. It's kind of patchwork right now. I think we'll get more clarity as the offseason goes on. I think Dieter is kind of your Tyler Larson, right? He's a younger guy. He's younger than Tyler Larson, I mean, but he's going to probably fill that role as a guy that can, kind of sub in at the center or guard position. I think he even played tackle in college. So again, that positional flex that nowadays is coaches just across the NFL love to see. I think Biotish is pretty much a lock for your starting center, barring any injury or significant, emergence of a contender in camp. I think that's pretty much your starting center, and I'm totally okay with that. I think from what I've learned about him since him coming aboard, and what I've seen is I I feel comfortable having him as a very quality, B level center in this league, and so I'm okay with that. Nick Allegretti, I see him as almost like a Wes Schweitzer kind of guy. A guy that that's coming over here. He's got some starts under his belt, but he's not never been kind of a full time, full year starter for anyone in this league. He's still on the younger side, and is a guy that will absolutely compete for a starting role. But ultimately, I think will I hope I hope I'm wrong, and I hope he's fantastic and is a absolute day one starter for us. But I think he's a guy that's like a Wes Schweitzer, can kind of come in, to give a guy a breather, or if there's an injury, come in and hopefully keep that continuity without really missing a beat. Um, Corin Lucas is really, I didn't really expect him to be re-signed, although I'm happy to see him re-signed because I think he's pretty consistent, and although being kind of up there in age at this point, has still shown he's a more than serviceable guy to have, especially as your swing tackle Tyna Secchi type player. Um, I think Andrew Wiley is a guy I would not be surprised you see him actually move in uh, to guard, whether that's on the left or right hand side. Clearly, he was not very good at tackle last year, and I find it hard to believe that Peters and company feel comfortable keeping him in that slot. So I actually think you could ultimately see a rookie starting at one of your tackle sides, maybe even Corin Lucas starting at the other tackle side with Trent Scott if he makes the team and another rookie tackle um, there as well with Andrew Wiley still being on this team as a tackle option if you need him, but maybe more likely, I could see them trying to move him to guard, get more value out of a guy like that because he's particularly still under contract with us. Um, anyways, um, I think that ultimately I like the moves they've done with O-line. I think there's going to be more movement there and as well as some positional kind of swapping around, if you will.
Just gotta applaud you on that Wes Schweitzer, um, comment. That's what we're all about here at Going Commando. Um, but absolutely,
Absolutely.
it is an interesting kind of position group. And yeah, I kind of when I was framing this to you guys, I also do not think that this is done. I would fully expect them to bring in, spend some draft capital on some offensive linemen. Let's not forget, guys, we have what is it, 3 second round picks and 2/3 this draft, or is it might be the other way around. Nonetheless, we're going to have a lot of picks in the top 100 and the opportunity to take guys that could come in and realistically, provide an impact kind of early on. Um, Now, moving ahead on the offense, I want to talk about kind of the weapons, if you will, pass catchers that we signed. There's only two of them. Those being, of course, veteran Zach Ertz, who we're all familiar with in the NFC East, and Olamide Zaccheaus, a guy that has some familiarity with Dan Quinn from the Atlanta days he spent last season as a member of the Eagles. So, uh, both these guys, Zach Ertz, I would expect to probably be starting center, maybe mentor a potential rookie that's brought in. He's certainly not what he used to be. He's definitely, on the downhill of his career. But I think he's proven to still be a reliable pass catcher, and it'll be his presence as a veteran will be very valuable, I believe, for whomever the young quarterback that we most likely will take is going to be. As for Zacchaeus, he's kind of a deep threat kind of guy, but he's nothing more than kind of a depth piece, I would say. I maybe he fights and gets a fourth wide receiver kind of designation, but I wouldn't expect he's kind of a depth guy, a guy that kind of would know the system. Um, don't necessarily expect a lot out of him, but what do you think about these two pass catchers that we have brought in?
Yeah, I think Zacchaeus is your Byron Pringle, really, for this staff. A guy that's still relatively, he's not too up there in years, right? And he's a guy that knows uh at least some of the staff. I know he's got like some connection to either Quinn or Kingsbury. I don't know off the top of my head. Actually, it might be a Brian Johnson a connection. That was the way, but I do remember there was some sort of connection to this staff, and so I would view him kind of like you said, Clark, as a depth piece, a guy that I do think will make this team, but likely as that fourth, fifth, maybe even sixth receiver. But again, he's definitely not a lock by any means. I think that they will target a wide receiver at some point in the draft. One thing I would like to mention that I think is uh, maybe telling, maybe not, is that of the 30, I guess, designated individual, visits that each team is allotted, we didn't spend a single one of those on a receiver, and we only spent two on tight ends, and both of those tight ends, to my knowledge, were not necessarily very highly rated or among the top of the T prospects, right? So what that to tell you one of two things, right? That tells you one, they're not prioritizing either of those positions, which I don't think is the case. Two, they don't want to show their hand to the league about who they're looking at the receiver and perhaps even the tight end position. So ultimately, I do think you will see more changes to both of these rooms. Um, Zach Ertz, in my opinion, is clearly the day one starter and ultimate mentor for this otherwise pretty young tight end group. Um, Obviously, Logan Thomas is no longer here, so Zach Ertz is kind of filling that role with likely a guy that absolutely comes with more experience and a more proven career and track record of success, but also a guy that um, has the ability, I think, to take a guy, either a rookie, if we were to get someone, or a guy like a Cole Turner, or even a Armani Rogers, under his wing, and really try to set those guys up for success the next year when, maybe Ertz is hanging up the cleats, or, trying to just get that one last year, single year deal here or elsewhere, right? Because let's be real, where he's at in his career, right? So I think that's again the Adam Peters tribe wanting to put a veteran in place to help instill our culture, help teach these young players, how to do it the right way, and a guy that's been in the league for so long and has been able to stay relevant for so many years. So I really like the Zach Ertz signing. The more that I think about it, and just also considering what else was available out there on the market, I mean, it was like a $4 or $5 million deal, if I'm not mistaken. So incredibly team friendly as well. So I like what they've done at these two positions. I don't think that we needed to go out and sign a bunch of receivers. I think we have solid depth at the position. Let's not forget they brought back Jamison Crowder, a guy that is a fan favorite here in Washington and has a storied history with us, and actually performed admirably last year, and actually exceeded expectations, I think, not only as a serviceable punt return option, which I think is a huge reason as why they brought him back, because we didn't have anyone else on the roster that you could say that about. And then also a guy that can absolutely step up and contribute on the receiving side when his number is called. And we saw that again last year. Perhaps one of the most consistent receivers on our team besides Terry last year was Jamison Crowder. So again, I like what they've done. I don't think they're done yet. And I think that you'll see some more movement here on draft day for both of these positions, especially receiver, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll add some context to the Olamide Zaccheaus signing. I mean, he was brought in under Dan Quinn at the Falcons. I believe they only played 1 year together.
Okay, got it.
Um, he is a UVA kid, which is a bit interesting because you don't see a lot of University of Virginia kids make it to the NFL as frequently. I agree with Clark. I think that he's probably going to be a 4 or 5 receiver. I mean, when you're in a room that has Dax Milne, um, and a room that has guys like Dax Milne and Jameson Crowder and even Kashmir Allen, I think it's gonna be hard to fight for your spot there. They do have him listed as a slot receiver, as from what I can tell, at least from a prospective depth chart. So I think that's an interesting place for him to be put, as we did see Jameson Crowder take over that role a bit more last year. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Jameson Crowder. He's an amazing guy to have met in person. He is a great return man, in recent history. Um, so I'm not mad at us getting Olamide Zaccheaus off of the free agent market. I do think, I wish we had maybe gone for 1 or 2 more names. I'm not necessarily sure that there was anything that splashy available. At least in terms of guys still left on the board. I mean, Odell is obviously still available, but what is he nowadays? There's a few other names on there like Hunter Renfro and even guys like Michael Gallup, who we might have even considered bringing back. There's certainly a lot of interesting names who are sort of left in the air. Um, However, I mean, we're gonna have to talk about it. I don't understand this Zach Ertz signing. I mean, we talked about it last year. I'm a strong proponent of this team has the number 32 tight end room in the league. Now, whether you fix that through the draft or not is still to be seen, but Zach Ertz feels like a step back. I mean, think about it. We went from Logan Thomas, who obviously, injuries aside, was an old guy to begin with. He switched to the position from quarterback. He saw some success at the position, but never really seemed to pan out. We move on to a guy who's a year older and even more removed from his greater years, or at least his most productive years in the NFL so far. And Clark, you make a great point. He will be that veteran presence for our young quarterback if we do end up going that route, uh, to sort of learn with and sort of have as a safety blanket, I guess, in some ways. Maybe I think more accurately, a guy who can tell him what a modern NFL quarterback needs to do in order to get into those successful positions. But it just really didn't make sense for me. I mean, I personally was a fan of Robert Tonyan, who was a younger guy on the market who had worked with Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay, who I had felt was a bit more uh, um, of an unknown quantity in a good sense, in the sense that there might still be something in there that's not tapped into, that hasn't been tapped into yet. And I'll be blatant about it. I was a big proponent of the Commanders trading away the second overall pick to move down and maybe take a guy like Brock Bowers, who seems to be a true tight end prospect that can do it all and comes out of that Georgia sort of tough tight end room that we saw last year have guys like Darnell Washington enter the league from. So it was a bit of a head scratcher here for me with the Zach Ertz signing. And I mean, it is a great point that he is an older veteran who can teach guys like John Bates, who can teach guys like Cole Turner, who can teach guys like Armani Rogers how to be more successful in the league and how to be a better receiving back and how to be the tight end who makes your quarterback better rather than the tight end who needs the ball 10 times a game to seem significant. Um, but it was just a head scratcher for me. I mean, it just seems like a step back by every metric in terms of guy who's just as injury riddled as Logan Thomas, who is older than Logan Thomas by age alone. I mean, it's crazy to think that Zach Ertz is only 33, but he is only 33. And that's old in this league, and his injuries are as much of a question mark as any of these other guys. So I found that to be a head scratcher. I certainly hope that we target these positions in the draft, whether that is early or late, at least to give us a different look or a different guy to throw out there in the preseason and get an idea of like, hey, maybe this is our guy. Hey, maybe John Bates moves forward and becomes our tight end one. Um, but yeah, I'm a little disappointed by our movement here in the pass catchers. I felt like that was a position where, you have all this cap room. Why not get that third true receiving option if we're going to have a pass first offense like we did last year? And for all intents and purposes, it seems like we're going to have this year with Cliff Kingsbury at our OC. So maybe I'm being a bit hyperbolic about the situation. Maybe it's not as bad as I would like to think it is, but it really was a disappointing offseason in terms of pass catchers, in my opinion.
I agree with you, Tom, that we are sitting at number 32 when it comes to overall tight end rooms. I don't think that's changed with the departure of Logan and the input of Zach Ertz. I think a lot of why the reason Zach Ertz is here is because it's pretty much a given, right? We're going to have a young quarterback in this in this on this team. Once that number 2 pick comes along, barring anything massively changing. And I think they want a guy like a Zach Ertz to kind of be that safety valve and kind of mentor, for not only the guys in the room but also that quarterback. Am I in love with Zach Ertz as a player and am I tantalized by what I think he can do for this offense for this team? No, not at all. Do I think it's going to be a lot of the same when it comes to what we got out of Logan Thomas with Zach Ertz from a skill level at this point in their careers? Yeah, I do. I also will say I'd be shocked if one, I do think this will be addressed in the draft, but even if it's not, I'd be shocked if you don't see a large number of UDFAs being at the tight end position being brought in to challenge these guys again, this ownership and staff has zero allegiance to Cole Turner, to John Bates, to Amani Rogers, right? Like all three of those guys could be displaced by even a UDFA easily, very easily. So I think I think that's just a position group we need to continue to keep an eye on. And yeah, I'm not here to say like to your point, Tom, like Zach Ertz does not move the needle for me when it comes to getting excited about this offense. But do I have an understanding of why it was done? A little bit, yeah.
I would agree. I wouldn't necessarily hit the panic button. Um, it would have been interesting to see some, I guess, a flashier name come across, our phones, from an Adam Schefter notification. But at the same time, we talked about this earlier. No need necessarily to make these big moves in year one. This rebuild is something that's going to take multiple years. And I don't see it necessary to bring in, the biggest name free agent of all time unless you know that you have an established team that this guy, and spending the money on that guy is going to make the difference. Um, with that being said, let's round off the offense by talking about the quarterbacks plural that were brought in the offseason. Of course, the first one, the more notable one, being former second overall pick Marcus Mariota, getting signed after spending a season with the Eagles. He didn't really get to see the field that much year before that, started a lot of games for Atlanta. And then the other guy that we brought in, a journeyman in Jeff Driscoll, a guy that not sure if you remember this, Chris, but we actually watched play in person at FedEx Field against the Lions in 2019. So, well, while he was with the Lions,
How could I
Redskins
forget?
final season 2019. Yeah. So Jeff Driscoll, from familiarity there, I guess with us. Not sure if, he'll make the team or what's going to happen with that. Could be the third guy. Or how many quarterbacks is this team going to keep? That's to be said. But nonetheless, two guys seemingly going to be backups for this team that got brought in.
Yeah, and both of these guys that we bring in, both in Marcus Mariota and Jeff Driscoll, are interesting guys on their own, let alone put together. Jeff Driscoll is a guy who in his high school class was the highest rated quarterback according to most of the recruit rating sites. He ended up having a little bit of troubles in college at the University of Florida, transferred down to Louisiana Tech, started sort of pick it up a little bit more, and you saw him bounce around the league, as Clark said, from team to team. He's a guy who honestly is pretty interesting in terms of a backup if we do decide to keep him, because he does have in-game NFL experience. He does have that sort of SEC football experience coming out of the University of Florida for his first 2 years in college. He is a guy who had a lot of expectations around him, and he kind of seemed to fail to live up to those expectations, at least in his current career. And Marcus Mariota, another guy who, listen, we're 10 years removed, I believe, from him being the number 2 overall pick to the Tennessee Titans. A Heisman winner in college, a guy who um, sort of redefined the era of scrambling quarterbacks in some ways, and sort of almost led to its downfall in Tennessee. Uh, he was on the Philadelphia Eagles last year, which I think was a really good and important move for him in terms of, really solidifying himself as a backup quarterback and getting an understanding of, like, listen, this is what the winning teams do. This is what, high level football looks like. And I think that he's going to be a really important mentor for that number 2 overall pick that we have this year, in terms of saying, hey, listen, these are the expectations. You have to, focus on this. You have to understand that this is going to happen. So I think both of these guys are going to be really interesting guys, at least for the beginning of the off season, or for the beginning of the preseason, for whoever we take at that number 2 spot in terms of a quarterback, if we do end up taking him, as both mentors and sort of, guys to bounce ideas off of, guys who have been there before to talk to you about what might happen if you don't necessarily live up to those expectations early. One more interesting note here that I do have about Marcus Mariota: I believe he will be the first player to wear the number 0 in the NFL. Um,
First
that
quarterback,
may or may
first
not,
quarterback in
first
NFL history
quarterback,
to wear
pardon
zero.
me, first quarterback, pardon me, to wear zero. So that is a interesting little tidbit about that add to our team. I'm not sure if either of these guys are necessarily needle movers, as Chris put it, but I'm interested to hear your guys' thought on either of these guys being, not long term, but certainly for this year being the backup in case whoever we get at number two does indeed happen to get a injury. Knock on wood.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with the departure of Jacoby Brissett now on the New England Patriots, they needed to bring in another veteran, established veteran, to kind of mentor and back up what we assume to be a quarterback at the number 2 overall pick. So why not bring in another former quarterback that was taken with the number 2 overall pick, who also has a similar kind of throwing play, mobile play style to the guy that a lot of us think might be the pick at number 2. So I think from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Am I concerned a little bit with Marcus Mariota as a starter for us? Should something happen to, whoever ultimately has that QB1 job, right? I would be a little concerned to have him start more than a few games for us. I also, I'm not sure if either of you saw like the mini kind of, uh, Hard Knocks esque type series they did a year or two ago. I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was quarterback. And one of the quarterbacks that they followed along was actually Marcus Mariota. Um, and I believe it might have been when he was, I can't remember what team he was necessarily on for that program.
Atlanta
Was
Falcons.
was it on the Falcons? Because he was on the
Yeah,
Eagles last year, right? Okay,
Atlanta Falcons.
he's on the Falcons. Thank you, Clark. And if I remember correctly, there were some concerns about his um, leadership style, some concerns about how he felt being benched for Desmond Ritter, and things like that, his attitude. So that concerns me a little bit, and that always kind of tainted my view of him as a quarterback in this league. And then I think he just, if I remember correctly, he just stopped showing up, one day because he went off and had surgery, but didn't even tell the team or anyone on the staff for that matter that he was going and doing that. So I'm not sure if that was a misrepresentation of his character or if that was blown out of proportion, but that kind of left a bad taste in my mouth when it came to Marcus Mariota as a player in this league. And so I was a little shocked for the staff to go out and, hey, we're going to go out and get Marcus Mariota. But everything aside from what the incidents that I just referenced, I think it makes sense. It's a guy that's definitely got some tread left on the tires, so to speak, and can absolutely play if his name is called upon. I just would be concerned having him start for, a multiple game stretch for us. But knock on wood there that we won't have to see that actually come to fruition. Obviously, I mentioned the departure of Brissett. You still have Jake Fromm on the roster. Now, do I think that's temporary? Yes. Do I think they brought in a guy like Jeff Driscoll because they don't love Jake Fromm? Yes. I think that's why you bring in a guy like Jeff Driscoll, a little bit more established in the league. Someone that they feel confident can come in and pick up a playbook quickly. A guy that's bounced around from some teams, so they're confident in his ability to kind of pick something up and be able to run with it effectively. I don't think they'll keep three. They very actually, you know what? I was about to say, I don't think they'll keep three active on their roster. They very well could, considering if the number one QB guy is a rookie. I'm not sure what they'll do there. Um, if I had to guess, I think that you won't see Jake Fromm here after training camp, and that those three, the rookie draft pick and Mariota and Driscoll will be the three guys that you see on this roster, or at least with the team. Um, but yeah, I don't have a ton more to say about this group. I think obviously there'll be some changes here within the next week.
And I think that our fans, listening will get to hear our thoughts on those changes as well. We're kind of going mostly through free agency in this episode, but we will have plenty of draft coverage later this week. So that kind of does it for the offensive players that we brought in and or re-signed. So with that being said, I think we should go ahead and kick off the defensive additions, which certainly, there were plenty of. And I think we could start at no other position group than linebacker, as this was a group that they signed four individuals into our linebacker room, those being Bobby Wagner, of course, being the most notable one, the future Hall of Fame middle linebacker that was brought in. Obviously, familiarity with Dan Quinn from his time in Seattle. Brought in Frankie Louvu, who has been a starter in Carolina for the past two seasons, had an NFC Defensive Player of the Week award to his name this past season. Seems to be a quality starting linebacker in this league. And then kind of two depth guys in Michael Walker and Anthony Pittman as well. And this linebacker group, one that was a position of need for a long time, it seems, for this team, and one that wasn't truly ever addressed under Rivera. But now, seemingly, two quality starting level linebackers have been brought in to kind of back the defensive line.
Absolutely, and this is a position group which had that drew our ire for the names that seem to keep being recycled over and over again. We remember, of course, guys like David Mayo in previous years, and I think that this is a really great sign that we are building towards something. I mean, Bobby Wagner is a guy who we're not far away from him being a part of the 99 club in Madden. He was considered one of the best linebackers in the entire NFL for multiple years. And Frankie Louvu, a guy who say what you will about that Carolina team, he was a very integral part of their defense and a big playmaker for them. Certainly not the only Carolina guy we brought over, but maybe the most important one in terms of our team. I think those two guys are guys that you're going to be hearing a lot about, especially in sort of these game scenarios, since they are such high impact and high production players. I think Anthony Pittman and Michael Walker are both very good ads in terms of depth. I wouldn't be mad about seeing either of these guys rotate onto the field. Both coming from very good defensive places, with Michael Walker, of course, being in Pittsburgh before this, a place well known for their stifling defense, and Anthony Pittman being a part of that Detroit Lions team that kind of shocked the world this year and won, a playoff game or two here or there. And all these guys, I mean, all these guys that we added, regardless of whether or not you think they are good, bad, ugly, whatever you may think, are great additions to this team compared to what we had in previous years. I don't think I have any notes for these ads other than the fact that, hey, if we're looking for places where we got better, categorically, empirically, and exponentially got better, it would be the linebacking core for me.
Yeah, and I think this is really, really, really important and perhaps the most drastic philosophy change that we'll see on the defensive side here with this new group is the prioritization of the linebacker position, a position which Clark alluded to as well as one that has been neglected and forgotten about under the Rivera regime and perhaps even prior, but particularly over the last 4 seasons has been an afterthought. And we've suffered because of it. When you have a poor linebacking group, it puts extra pressure on the defensive front to perform. And we saw their we've had this. Now it's a little bit different than what it's looked like over most of the Rivera regime, right? But we always talked about we have this insane defensive front. How come they're not getting to the quarterback and having the success that we would expect them to? Well, you've got fucking Cody Barton, excuse my language, David Mayo, guys like, you know, Khaleke Hudson, backing them up and filling the gaps, alongside them. And so it's putting enormous pressure on that defensive front to overcompensate for the lack of skill, in that middle level. And the same goes for the secondary. We've had a lot of solid secondary players over the last couple of years, some, not all, right? And they've been hindered and haven't been able to look as good and perform as at high of a level because they're making up for the lack of play from the linebacker position. I mean, really only Jamin Davis, and we've still only seen sparks and highlights of what we were hoping he could truly be. So overall, this prioritization of the linebacker position, I think, is going to revolutionize the defense, and it's going to be the most significant change from what you've seen, in the defense last year and years prior to what we're seeing on the field now. And so I just wanted to call that out because I just really think that it's a massive philosophy change when it comes to Peters and company coming in here. They've addressed the position, maybe not necessarily long term. I think Frankie Luvu is a guy you will see here. He's a guy who's just really coming into his prime. A guy that one of the few guys we're actually excited to see come into our team from the Carolina Panthers. That's something we definitely couldn't say for most of the guys that we've seen come into the franchise from Carolina over the last few years. So a welcome addition from Charlotte. But overall, I was pleased with that. He'll be with the team for a while. Bobby Wagner, you mentioned, Tom, a perennial Pro Bowler and elite talent in this league, obviously up there in years, but he's still clearly shown he's got a lot of gas left in the tank, or at least enough for another season. Still played at a high level last year. Will be an excellent mentor, not only for that linebacker group, but for the entire defense as a whole. And it's really a positive band-aid for a position that I think will continue to see addressed as these years progress. And then those two depth guys you mentioned, Pittman and Mikal Walker, I think those are both guys that are upgrades to our linebacker depth, guys that are likely would have been preferred starters, maybe even over, certainly over a David May or an Khaleke Hudson, but maybe even a Cody Barton as well. I would hope so. So very pleased with what they've done with this group. I'm curious to see how Jamin Davis, fits back in to this cohort here as well. I think you'll see a lot more play with multiple linebackers on the field, maybe even 3 linebacker sets, something that we seldom saw under Rivera at all, and probably for good reason because we didn't have the talent there to deploy those kinds of looks. But again, very pleased with just the approach to this position. And I think it's going to pay dividends, not only for this group, but for the entire defense collectively.
Yeah, bringing in a guy like a Bobby Wagner with such a pedigree to his name, everybody's going to gravitate instantly to him. And like you said, he's still racking up a lot of tackles. For the longest time, he was one of the best coverage linebackers in the NFL, but with his kind of increased age, that I believe has gone a little bit by the wayside. And the same goes for Luvu. He has 1 interception in 6 years in the NFL, really only 2 years kind of as a full-time starter. Um, but what Luvu brings to the table that I think they might try to utilize is his ability as a pass rusher as well. He had 7 sacks in 2022 and 5.5 last year, kind of still acting as a majority interior um, linebacker. So, like you said, bringing in other guys, maybe having, moving Luvu around is something that might expect to see them do that would allow maybe all 3 of those guys, including Jamie Davis and Bobby Wagner, to be on the field at the same time. Nonetheless, it's a versatile. Both these guys have different skill sets that they brought in, and I am excited to hopefully have some consistent play at the linebacker spot. That'll take us to the next kind of position group. And you mentioned it, Chris, our defensive line. It is going to look different. Obviously, trading away our 2 big edge rushers in Sweat and Young in the middle of last season. You're still going to have the 2 Alabama boys in Allen and Payne, but you bring in several names that are actually kind of starting level guys in the NFL. Dorrance Armstrong and Dante Fowler Jr. Dorrance Armstrong and kind of a more interior-ish guy, not as much of an edge rusher. Is listed as a defensive end, but Dorrance Armstrong was a solid player for that team in Dallas that got to the quarterback and was one of the best defenses in the NFL over the past several years. and Fowler as well, a kind of a guy that's bounced around to a lot of teams. He was a high draft pick to the Jaguars a while ago, a veteran that's been around. So another guy I'd expect to see kind of start right away. And then Cleveland Farrell, another guy we picked up, a former first round pick of the Raiders. Um, you know, clearly, a quality NFL player coming in as well. So we signed those three defensive linemen to kind of come in. All of them potentially could see playing time. How do you think that they are going to mesh with the two kind of interior studs we already have? And with that being said, how do you expect these guys to be used on this new defense from Joe Witt Jr.?
Yeah, not much to be said here, other than it's clear that that Joe Witt and obviously Dan Quinn are going for guys that know their system, and you got to be happy about that because they will be able to make an impact hopefully in the first year, if not, maybe a little bit deep into the first season. Um, Certainly guys who move the needle. I mean, Dorrance Armstrong is one of the better defensive ends for Dallas last year on a defense that had, the defensive player of the year by most of people's account. And then Dante Fowler obviously has moved around a lot, but he seemed to really find his footing under Dan Quinn and Joe Witt in Dallas. Cleveland Farrell, as you mentioned, early draft pick by the Raiders, didn't really pan out. This ended up probably being our Chase Young hole filler. Cleveland Farrell comes over from San Francisco. He's going to be wearing number 99, which is a bit interesting, obviously, considering the last 99 went to San Francisco. But I think all these guys that we brought in are certainly guys who know the system, understand the system, and aren't going to need too much coaching on at least the plays of the system, and might be able to help along some of those younger guys like KJ Henry, and Andre Jones Jr. in terms of getting used to it and maybe being a rotation guy in terms of the defensive line, especially if we end up having sort of these long, grueling drives that we've been known to have at times with the Commanders. So I think that all the guys they brought in were very positive in this group. I think it's great to have guys that know the system come in so that we don't necessarily have to worry about coaching them up on it. And overall, I think this is another place for us to be happy with our additions, if they were somewhat minimal in a sense.
Yeah, I think that they needed to do some work here and make multiple moves. I mean, obviously, Chase Young and Montez Sweat departed mid-season last year. And we were left with the likes of James Smith Williams, Casey Toohill, among some of our other guys that we had in there, rookies such as KJ Henry, Andre Jones, and a couple other guys filling in the gaps there. So obviously, we needed to do something. I think Dorrance Armstrong is a clear starter on one side, especially indicative of the deal that they gave him being a 3-year deal. I believe it was somewhat significant. I think over 20 million and maybe even closer to 30 million in terms of that 3-year deal. So I think he absolutely is a starter on one side. And then I think you see a guy like Cleveland Farrell likely get the first crack at being the starter opposite him, just given he was a first round pick only 5 or so years ago. Um, but I think you also see Dante Fowler, vying for that spot as well. And if not starting, absolutely getting a good chunk of rotational snaps in. Let's not forget they are bringing back F.A. Obata. Now he is coming off a very serious injury. Many of us probably thought that was probably it for the guy. He's not necessarily a young, uh, I think he's about 30 or so. So he's not exactly a spring chicken, but it was interesting to see him be brought back. I do believe he also has Dan Quinn ties, so that could be the reason he was brought back over a guy like a Casey Toohill or a James Smith Williams who's slightly younger. You're probably getting somewhat similar play out of and might have a little bit more upside too. So I was a little like taken aback to see that, but overall, I've been okay with the moves made here. Do I think they could add a defensive end in the draft? I do. Am I hoping that they take one? If so, I would hope that it was in the later rounds. I don't think it's a big enough need to spend a first or a second round pick on, even really a third for that matter. I wouldn't hate a third round pick on a defensive end, but again, that said, I don't think it's a top priority need for us. So, I feel good about this group. I think that this group can perform at a high level with the complementary play you're going to get from those linebackers, like I kind of alluded to when we were talking about the linebacker position. Um, so I think in terms of ends, I think we'll be just fine. You saw that we were actually somewhat serviceable from a defensive end perspective, even after the departure of Montez Sweat and Chase Young. Right, we didn't actually see a dip, that much of a dip in edge rush play, which is both good and concerning uh, for us there. And then when you look at the interior, like you said, Clark, not a ton to discuss there. Obviously, have Allen and Payne holding it down. I would fully, obviously, Fedarian Mathis is still on the roster. I expect him to be here. I expect John Ridgeway to still be here as well. I think they did actually add a defensive tackle, nose tackle. I could not tell you his name, but it's like an international pathway, players program, and not David Botta, who I believe they are also parting ways with. But I think we brought
R.I.P.
in
David
basically
Vada.
right, right. I mean, we all honestly need to have a quick moment of silence for David Botta's likely departure from this team. But the good news is we may have David Botta 2.0 joining the team as well. So stay tuned on that, folks. We'll definitely be giving you all the coverage of that if it does turn out to be a David Botta 2.0. But yeah, overall, I think this defensive line is going to be better than it was last year because you have the complementary play backing it up.
Yeah, that'll be a storyline we're going to keep our eye on all season long. That's a tough guy to replace, David Vada. But in all
Culture
seriousness,
guy.
yeah, I mean, you need those culture guys, looking across the board. Be interesting to see who can kind of take, take the flame, so to speak, and carry pass the torch. But nonetheless, we've kind of got one more position group here on the defense, and then a couple of special teams guys we can briefly talk about. The secondary signed 4 players to the secondary. Of course, some departures from the secondary as well. Notably, uh, starter Kendall Fuller, who had been with us for a very long time, or was drafted, left, and came back. Spent a lot of years with our franchise. Um, but we signed 3 cornerbacks and a safety. Those being cornerbacks Noah Igbinoghene. I listen. This is gonna. We'll learn week 1 how to
I
say
think
this
it's
guy's name.
I think it's Igbenogany.
Noah Igbinoghene, a cornerback from the Miami Dolphins. Also signed Michael Davis, a cornerback from the Chargers. James Pierre, a cornerback from the Steelers, as well as safety Jeremy Chin, another Carolina Panthers defensive player joining this team. So Davis and Pierre, not as much knowledge on those guys, but Chin, I know a player who had some flashes for this Carolina Panthers team. Was a second round pick for them and played a lot of games in 4 seasons, started a lot of games, and actually came in second place for defensive rookie of the year his rookie season. So still a guy with a lot of potential, only 25 years old.
I'm excited about Jeremy Chin. I'm glad you touched on him there at the end. I think that he's going to be the safety that we were hoping and waiting for from a lot of these guys that we've kind of put our money on or had our hopes up for over the years. Another guy, another Carolina Panther that I'm actually happy to see coming to Washington. So I'm pumped about Jeremy Chin. I think you'll see him on the field a lot. And obviously with the departure of Cam Curl, we needed a guy. We needed a guy to come in and kind of hold the fort down at the safety position, so to speak, and be curious to see how Derek Forrest kind of comes back after a season-ending injury early in the season last year, and see how what level of play he kind of is bringing to the table here. and what work may or may not still need to be done at that position. Obviously, we did bring back our boy Jeremy Reeves, All Pro Revo. Very happy to see that. That actually is a culture guy that I think that they recognized as a leadership and ownership group that would be detrimental to the locker room not to bring back. So we definitely wanted to bring a guy like that back into the room versus a guy like Cam Curl, who you're getting a little bit better play out of, but really not the level of play that we were accustomed to, or at least hoping to. Granted, he was a 7th round pick, but you know, when compared to Reeves, he's not bringing that level of leadership nor the level of, special teams ace play that you really see out of Jeremy Reeves, and also the ability to fill in admirably at the safety position. So really like what I'm seeing out of Jeremy Reeves, or Jeremy Chin rather. We got two Jeremys back now there, I guess. Um, but the cornerback position, this position probably scares me the most out of any positional group right now on the defensive side. And it's because we've lost Kendall Fuller, who I did like and I did have faith in as pretty much our only corner that I had any level of faith in. And the guys they've brought in, I hope they're good, and I hope that they can be, significant contributors to this team. But no one that they didn't bring in any heavy hitters or any big names, which I'm not saying they should have done. But what I'm saying is it's a very unproven group. It's a group of guys with not a ton of starting experience in that cornerback room. Obviously, you're bringing back guys like Emmanuel Forbes. You're bringing back guys like Quan Martin, who's kind of a hybrid DB for us, who we saw some good flashes out of last year. You'll still have Benjamin St. Juice as part of that group. So there are there is a cast there that I can be okay with. I do think that they are going to address cornerback in the draft as well, and maybe even in free agency as well, as the draft shakes out and we see what happens there. I could see them continuing to add bodies to this group. And then really, I think this is going to be one of the most competitive groups in training camp as well. I don't think by any means there's a defined um, roster lineup at cornerback for this team. I think there's a lot of guys that are going to be fighting for those last few spots. Guys like, Christian Holmes, guys like Tariq Castro Fields that were part of the old regime that are really, not going to be really competing at a disadvantage here. Because in my opinion, even if you are a guy like Christian Holmes or Tariq Castro Fields or someone like that, that maybe is, on pen and paper and on the field, you're getting virtually the same level of play as a guy like, Noah Igbenogany or Michael Davis or the other gentleman they brought in, right? But they're going to give the nod to the guy that they brought in if it's virtually the same. So those guys are facing an uphill battle. St. Juice, I think he's safe enough to make this team this year, hopefully, as a guy that does, like St. Juice. But, he could find himself really at the bottom of this depth chart come the season start. A guy that's been a starter for us for the last few seasons could barely be seeing the field here, I think, as this room continues to shake out. So overall, all that said, I like the moves. I think there's going to be more moves made, and I think it's a very untested, unproven group that does still have me worried a little bit where we're at right now with the cultivation of this new group.
Yeah, and this is a secondary. Once again, I'll reiterate Chris's point that I'm very scared of in some ways. I mean, you make a great point there about Emmanuel Forbes kind of being a guy who we drafted early, and I think that he's a guy that had a lot of issues, but honestly, I just look at that as growing pains for a rookie cornerback in the NFL. I mean, you kind of want to be able to get to a point with him where you're at least getting some return on your investment and the draft capital that you spent on him. Um, as for Jeremy Chin, I'm very excited as well as the rest of the guys. I think that there is a chance that we do see him starting by maybe even the start of the season over guys like Derek Forrest and Percy Butler. And Jeremy Reeves obviously has to be getting an out after his contract. But I think an interesting one here is Noah Igbenogany, which I know it's a very weird name to see spelled out, but it is Igbenogany as far as I'm aware. He's a lengthy guy who honestly has been sort of an undervalued, but not highly productive, but productive guy in all of his stops. And I think you could see him sort of leapfrog his way up into that top three cornerback spot, along with some of the guys that we brought in free agency. I think a lot of this secondary is going to be determined by what kind of scheme we end up running defensively, and whether that continues to stay mainly the same as they ran in Dallas, or whether they start to throw some loopholes in and maybe try and change things up. I think that the secondary is going to be something which we're going to have all the eyes on, especially given the passing nature of the NFL and the fact that there's been a lot of holes there at times, and we try to fill them with draft picks. And you talk about guys like Benjamin St. Juste who have seemingly gotten slightly better over the years, and with each consecutive year. And I think it'll be interesting to see um, just how this defense ends up being schemed out and what guys they end up putting on the field week one for the Commanders. But certainly there's a lot of hope with as much skepticism and maybe fear as we're entering the year with this group.
Yeah, I want to call out that is a good point you make, Tom. This scheme is likely going to look a lot different than what we've seen in the past, and particularly with the strengths of the linebacker group now. You'll likely see less DBs all on the field at once as often as we did under the Rivera slash Jack Del Rio scheme. You'll probably see more often, two cornerback, two safety sets rather than these, three, sometimes four cornerback sets, plus safeties that we were seeing under Rivera. I could be wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. And yeah, ultimately, I think it will also come down to what type of cornerbacks this staff and scheme is looking for. Is it going to be more of a guy like a Benjamin St. Juste who's kind of lengthy, a little bit handsy, right? But like isn't necessarily your slot corner by any means. Or are we going to be looking for more of those fast twitch guys that can kind of hang with the fastest receivers in the NFL, but they're not going to wow you with their pass breakup or length or anything like that, right? So I'm curious to see how that shakes out, and really curious to see the level of play from these guys that they signed at the cornerback position. Are these just depth camp guys? Or are they actually ballers that can perform at a high level? And just back to touching on safety, you mentioned Percy Butler. I almost forgot about him. Um, I have, correct. You guys tell me otherwise, but I really haven't seen anything out of Percy Butler, and I think the time he's been here to lead me to believe that he's an option for us as anything more than a special teams and back end depth guy. I wouldn't consider him a lock for this team by any means either. But overall, I think progress and positive direction was made. I think there's a lot more to be done.
Finally, to kind of round out the offseason additions prior to the draft, got two guys that are special teamers coming in that, should seemingly fill their roles well. We have Tyler Ott, a long snapper signed, as well as veteran kicker Brandon McManus, who spent a lot of years in Denver, was with the Jaguars, and now finds himself as a member of the Washington Commanders. So it seems that Joey Sly's time in Washington has come to an end. Wasn't necessarily a tumultuous time with him. I thought he was a decent kicker. He was a little bit limited in sometimes. That's not going to be the case with Brandon McManus. This is a guy who, has made these 60 plus yarders in his career, and is known for kind of having a big leg. So um, definitely excited to see McManus being brought in. And then Tyler Ott, I mean, listen, man, as long as you can get the ball from point A to point B, I think that's going to be all that really matters with this guy. And obviously that wasn't the case with Cameron Cheeseman all the time. Kind of moments throughout the season that had you scratching your head as to why he was still our long snapper until finally they did elect to cut him during the season. So, um, I think that these are two guys that, you know, unless a crazy case of the yips is discovered, I think both of these guys will be able to fill their roles well.
Yeah, agreed. I was not a Joey Sly hater by any means, but if there's an upgrade to be had and available, let's do it. So as long as Brandon McManus can be consistent for us, then he's got my vote, and I have confidence in the staff thus far. So I have confidence in Brandon. Let's go, Brandon. And then secondly, Tyler Ott, another guy that was clearly brought in to fix a problem that Rivera created by bringing in Cam Cheeseman, you know, wasting a draft pick on him and also trading up to get that draft pick to waste on him. I'll never understand why we got rid of um, what's his face, Nick Sundberg in the first place, way back when. But regardless, happy to see this move. Hopefully, he can provide some continuity. I don't want to hear his name the entire season because if I don't hear his name, that means he's doing a good job. So let's hope that this is the last time we'll really even have to discuss Tyler Ott. And that the only time we see him is when he's, on the field doing his job. So overall, happy with these moves, and I think obviously things that were needed to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, very little notes here. I think everyone is well aware of the fact that our kicking has not necessarily been the cream of the crop in the past few years. Joey Sly obviously had a hell of a leg on him in terms of getting the ball down the field, but his accuracy was in question at times. Brandon McManus is a guy who's been through a lot of NFL teams. He's been a rather consistent kicker, all things said, not super prone towards missing. But as long as he keeps it through the uprights for us, as long as he does his job as a kickoff specialist as he's projected to be for us, then I don't see any issue with bringing in a guy like Brandon McManus. I also like that it is a proven name that we're bringing into the kicking spot rather than an unknown quantity. Tyler Ott, obviously, sad to see Cameron Cheeseman go, one of our favorite names on this Commanders team. But Tyler Ott was in Baltimore, which has always been very well renowned for their special teams, and the fact that we got a piece of that, or at least a player who was somewhat integral to that, that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable with the way that our special teams is moving. Although we hopefully will not have to see them for anything other than free extra points and kickoffs. Um, but we shall see how these signings affect us truly by the time season starts.
That can be said for all of these signings that were made this offseason. Certainly a lot of them that we went through with you all tonight. And that's going to take us to the end of this episode. And obviously, there's a lot more kind of on the plate of this Washington Commanders team on the horizon. And we're going to give you guys coverage of that as well. You'll be hearing our live reaction to the draft pick as well as analysis on kind of what we think is going to happen this upcoming weekend as well. So, for my co hosts, Tom and Chris, my name is Clark. You've been listening to the Going Commando podcast. We hope that you tune in next time. We hope that you've enjoyed your time listening. And as always, HTTR and HTTC.